Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Annika Nordquist. In honor of the Christmas season, in today's show, we are discussing the persecution of Christians in the Middle East, the historic cradle of the Christian faith, and, in fact, Jesus himself. The following is an interview with Father Benedict Kiely, a priest who has devoted his ministry to serving Christian communities in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq through a nonprofit called Nazarene. Since this interview was recorded on site at a conference, the audio quality is unfortunately a little bit worse than usual, but nonetheless, I hope you enjoy our fascinating and timely conversation about Father Ben's travels into some of the most dangerous parts of the Middle East. With no further ado, let's dig in. Father Ben, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you. So in terms of places to spread the gospel, talk about the word of God, there are a million places you can go. You can go to like the mountains of Japan, and where people probably don't know very much about Christianity. And if you are focused on kind of building up historic Christian communities, you can just as easily go to a cafe in Paris and in comfort spread the word over a croissant and a cup of hot chocolate. And yet you chose to go to Mosul. So talk me through that. What was it that drew you to the most inhospitable possible region in the world?
Well, first, it wasn't to spread the gospel, because of course the gospel was there and had been there for really 2,000 years. And that was really the point, that it all started in August of 2014 when I was a parish priest in Stowe, Vermont. And I heard that for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. There would be no mass in Mosul because ISIS had overrun it. And as listeners know, probably Mosul is Nineveh, the tomb of Jonah, which ISIS blew up. And so I remember thinking how awful it was that this happened. What shall we do? So people were wearing in those days sort of rubber bracelets advertising various things. And I thought, well, we could get those rubber bracelets made with the Arabic N, the Nun, which ISIS had marked the houses of Christians with. They can wear them, they can remember to pray for them, and a little bit of money can go. And so from that, we made them lapel pins. It all sort of took off. And then someone in DC said to me, which was rather amusing as they've never been to Iraq, they said, well, Father, you must go, otherwise you'll have no credibility. Well, I never actually thought at whatever age I was then, 50-something, 51, 2. I'd never thought I'd go to Iraq, but yeah, I went in May 15. ISIS was still down the road, thousands and thousands of Christian refugees, or IDPs rather, internally displaced people who'd been driven out with nothing. Were all in Erbil in Iraq. And from then on I went again and again, and just felt more and more of a call as a priest to devote my whole priestly ministry to aid and advocacy for the persecuted church. And so now we're in 2022. I have a charity that does that, and my full-time work is as a priest, speaking, writing, teaching, but also aiding the persecuted, particularly in the Middle East. The advocacy is for worldwide persecution, but the particular aid so far is we're in 3 countries. We're in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon.
And so I think it's interesting because you've talked about this ages-long continuity between Christianity in that part of the world and Christianity today. When you've spent time with those Christian communities in the Middle East, what have you found in terms of like what they're like compared to Christianity in the West, the continuity of their practice?
Well, the continuity that you experience first and foremost is parts of the Mass, including the Lord's Prayer, are in Aramaic, the very language, or very close to the language of Jesus. But also, not just that, they are speaking it conversationally. I remember once I was in a convent and one of the nuns took a call on the cell phone. I knew it wasn't Arabic, and I said, well, sister, what language? Aramaic. On the cell phone. So that continuity is extraordinary. Plus, for us in the West, often the Christians there laugh, although it's a wry laugh, because sometimes they're asked, well, when did we bring the gospel?
Right.
I was, sorry, it's the other way around. We've been here for 2 disciples of Jesus came to Iraq, Syria, I mean, it's in the Acts of the Apostles. They were the first Christians, and Lebanon. It's all the Holy Land.
Mm-hmm.
So the continuity is extraordinary. It's 2,000 years, basically.
Yeah. And so when you arrive in these kinds of regions, and I know a number of Protestant missionary families, and what they do, it seems, I mean, in the Middle East and also elsewhere, is they arrive and they try their best to blend in. They bring their wife and children. Maybe they have some kind of nominal job that they're in the region for, so they can kind of do church planting undercover. As a priest, I imagine that you would have some difficulty employing that exact strategy. You don't have a wife or children. What do you do once you're on the ground? How do you avoid unwanted attention, and how do you go about the work that you need to do?
Well, in the first times in Iraq was going to Erbil, and ISIS was occupying the Nineveh Plain, the Christian areas. So I wasn't going to church. I was going specifically as a priest to see how one could help. So obviously, to start with, it was making sure that people were being fed and housed in some way, shape or form. So I raising money for that. And it's comparatively safe there. I mean, one of my priest friends is on the Nineveh Plain now. Whenever I've gone, I often ask him, I say, Father, is it safe? He says, Father, it's never safe. It's not coming. But the first time out, once ISIS had been pushed, we went out into the Nineveh Plain in 2017, got fairly close to Mosul and to the town of Karablesh, which had only just been liberated, and we could hear the coalition bombs going off in Mosul. And that's a bit more tricky. The only time I've ever had any armed guards was when we went into Mosul the following year, because there were still bombs, there were still some bodies, and there was still some ISIS around. So it was a bit. Syria was the same. It was slightly more nerve-wracking. Syria is really a serious place, not just with the fact that the war's going on, but it's very hard to get into. And, I've never really felt that afraid. The most unnerving thing was leaving Syria in 19, crossing the border into Lebanon, and the whole Lebanon sort of revolution had started, and that was a nightmare. But it's people are very even a lot of the Muslims are quite respectful to the priests. They're
interesting.
So I mean, obviously, if you're going to hit someone who's an ISIS supporter, then they're not
right.
But, no, it's very much to go in to see what's going on, and also to get to know people. The other thing is sometimes a lot of groups, certainly now, because they weren't going in when it was more dangerous, go into places like Iraq, and it's a bit of a publicity show. You've got to actually get to know people, that they trust you, that you're not coming in and then disappearing. And so, having been 8 times now, obviously I know quite a few people, and that's good. They know that I've been coming since 15, so that's a blessing.
So just to clarify, how long do you usually stay when you go there? And 2, when did you go most recently?
I usually only go for about a week. Okay. In the early days, that was actually wise, because you didn't want to hang around for too long. Because also you're dealing with this, it's so complicated. The government, who's good, who's bad, if you're saying the wrong things, it's really, a lady, when I first went, said to me, you've got to leave all your preconceived ideas behind. She just said, it is so complicated, and that's absolutely true. When I was last, it was just before Christmas this year, because of COVID, it had been impossible to get in. And that was great to be able to get back to see, for example, some of the businesses that we've helped support, that they're doing okay, and in fact, none of them have closed.
Wow.
Thanks.
That was one of the questions I was going to ask, was like, how has it survived? I mean, COVID particularly, because that is one that seems as though it's had just such a more drastic economic impact in more third world places.
Well, it did. I mean, there's no 2 ways about it. It was a disaster. The only sort of weird good thing about it was that people couldn't emigrate.
Right.
But, that's a real issue, especially for young people. But basically for 3 years they weren't able to leave. But in terms of the job situation, this is what we do.
Right.
In terms of the advocacy, mini microfinancing small family businesses. And that's critical for them because if they have a business, we can't do anything about security.
Right.
But if they start a little business, they stay. And obviously it's not just charity, they have the dignity of working, they employ other people. And so part of that is when I go, I want to see that the money is being used properly, et cetera, et cetera. And I was very gratified that all the businesses basically, they're okay, they're doing okay. Wow. Because at least if you've got a business, there's a hope.
Right.
The problem in Lebanon, which I was just in June, is that the businesses are surviving, but it's a disaster because the country has economically collapsed. And I wrote a piece for the European Conservative called I refer to it as the Catch-22 country. Right. Because they have no power 22 hours a day, but they have not enough money to pay for the fuel for generators. So, for example, one of the businesses we help is a dairy business. And what do you do when you can't run the refrigerators and everything? So they try and start a business, but they can't. It's really, and the West doesn't seem to be taking any notice of that. They're not persecuted in the sense of, the Hezbollah, etc. But the problem is Christians are leaving. So once again, you've got the Middle East, another country in the Middle East where Christians are just disappearing. This is why the West, Christians in the West, should be so concerned.
Yeah. Well, I guess can you unpack that for me a little bit? Because I think a lot of people would say, oh, it's good. They're leaving a war-torn region. This kind of helps everyone involved. It keeps them out of harm's way. It might even help national cohesion in the places that they're leaving. What is your view on that?
Well, I'd say it's all wrong.
Yeah. I would guess so.
It's because, first, as you said, they've been there from the beginning. Right. They are an integral part of the Middle East, and they are, in fact, the Christians have always been sort of a bridge. Certainly, I know everyone goes back to the Crusade, and that's just such rubbish. From the middle classes. And they provide a king, I think it was actually King Abdullah of Jordan said, we need the Christians there. The Middle East, the cradle of Christianity, without Christians would be just horrendous. We can't encourage that at all. Obviously people, if they're scared and they want a life where they can bring up their children and no one can begrudge them that, but at least if they've got possibilities, that's why it's what we do with the businesses. Because at least they can say, okay, I can stay now because I've got a job. Right. If there's no jobs, they will go. That's the ways about it. It's not even security. It's if there's no work, they'll go. Right.
One of the interesting kind of statements that you made that I'd also like to dwell a little bit on is you've mentioned this in multiple places, the idea of sort of having preconceptions about places like Syria and arriving and having those turned on their head. That's very interesting to me. What would you say are some of those conceptions that you experienced when you were there?
Well, part of it is who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. I mean, in the early days, for example, the West was certainly saying, and there's a certain truth to it, that the Kurds were really good. But then you talk to the Christians, and then you remember that the Kurds were involved in the Armenian genocide, and which was more than Armenians, it was Syrians, etc. And there's a battle between the Kurds and the Iraqis, the Christians in the middle. It's just, as I said, it's very, very complicated. If you come in, someone said to me once, I was talking about another charity group or agency, and this chap said to me, oh, well, they have an agenda. Right. And I said to him, well, everyone's got an agenda. This is the thing. So what we're trying to do, you have to cut it down to the basics. We are Christians, we're trying to help Christians stay, we want to support them, and we want the West to support them by prayer and action. But it's not a Western concept. It's Arab, it's Eastern, it's not so clear cut. That's probably what I'd say most.
So, like from your time in the region, because I think one other kind of thing I've heard discussed, particularly in Christian circles, is the distinction between Eastern and Western Islam, and whether or not they are the same, and whether or not people of those groups think the same way and think the same things. And from what you've said already, it seems as though your experience is that Eastern Islam is also not a monolith, that there's quite a lot of people, based on what you said, it sounds like people who are sympathetic towards ISIS and sort of the average people you would be dealing with were not necessarily intersecting groups. Can you talk to me a little bit about what your experience was dealing with Islam on the ground, what you've learned? And I'm also curious if you would agree with the assessment that Western Muslims and Eastern Muslims do not necessarily think the same way or have the same priorities.
Well, once again, it's very, very complicated.
Yeah.
Because first and foremost, most of this is a war, an internal war between Shia and Sunni Islam. Christians are in the middle. Unfortunately though, wherever Christians are in the minority, they're at least second-class citizens. They suffer, whether it's physical violence or not. That being a second-class citizen in most Arab countries is a real problem.
Yeah.
It has to be said, without being so-called Islamophobic, the person I respect most in terms of writing is the great Coptic Jesuit, Father Khalil Samir, he's an Egyptian Coptic priest, old man now, but he wrote a book, I think it's called 111 or 101 Questions about Islam. And he says, and it's factual, he says, look, everything ISIS did is Islamic.
Right.
I mean, it may be 7th century Islamic, but you heard so often, this violence is not Islam.
Right. Actually,
it is.
Right.
It doesn't mean all Muslims do it or have to do it. But to say it is not Islam, well, what is it? Is it Christian Science?
Right.
Honestly, it's Islam. It's a particular interpretation which was fed for so long by the Wahhabi doctrines sent by Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. So, but if you talk to the people on the ground, I mean, they lived in peace, but certainly in Syria. But when push came to shove, I mean, I remember talking to a priest from Mosul. He was in a refugee camp when I first met him in Erbil. He's back in Mosul. He's the only priest in Mosul, and he said to me, "My 800-year-old church is an ISIS torture center. My house was stolen by my neighbors." So we can be very politically correct in the West, but when push comes to shove, that's part of the reality. However, there's a beautiful story I'll tell. One of the people I work closely with in Iraq, while the fighting was still going on, it was coming towards the end, but ISIS was still in Mosul, Christians organized bringing food to very close to Mosul, one of the bridges, and one of the men said to him, why are you helping us?
Right.
We were your enemies. And he said, because we're Christians. So we try and put love into action, but I say we must tell, sorry to go on too long, but there's also a very good quote, Cardinal Angelo Scola, who was the cardinal from Milan, said, and he went to Iraq early as well in 2015, he said, when you speak about Christian persecution, you must speak with total honesty and complete transparency. And so that's biblical. It's saying what you've seen and heard. It might not be palatable, but you must tell the truth, but in charity. There's no point in covering it up and pretending it's all cozy.
Yeah.
You tell the truth.
So I want to start kind of incorporating the West into this conversation, because obviously the Middle East is not an island. And in fact, the West, I mean, obviously the Middle East has affected the West a lot in terms of Christianity and spreading the gospel, as we've discussed. But at the same time, in recent times, it seems more the opposite, that what the West has done has kind of thrown the Middle East this way and that. And so just to sort of begin discussing that, how has Western involvement in the region affected the Christian communities there? I mean, most famously, there was the pullout from Afghanistan recently, which is not, as far as I'm aware, at least a region that you've worked in. But I imagine that it would have fostered instability in other places as well in some ways.
Well, completely. You talk to the Iraqis about 2003 and the war.
Yeah.
John Paul II famously warned. He said, if this invasion happens, it will destroy, I think he said, or certainly gravely damage the life of Christians in the Middle East, and that's exactly what's happened. Because this is also one of the things that Western people struggle with, that in terms of wanting it to be very simplistic. That yes, of course, Saddam was a dictator. Yes, Assad in Syria is a dictator. However, there was stability and peace. The perfect example of this is a priest, again, I know in Iraq, who was in Iraq. He said to me, in terms of living under Saddam and now, he said, there's better or worse. Which would you like to live under? Right. Well, obviously, better. So, was it perfect? No. People also forget, long before the American, or after the invasion, but before ISIS, there were, from the invasion though, also the Shia and Sunni, but the Christians started being murdered, being martyred, to the point where when ISIS came in 2014, in fact the majority of the Christians had already left Mosul. It was too dangerous. So now unfortunately the West, and they have long memories. I was going over the bridge into Mosul, as I said, just before Christmas, and the two men, the police general with me and my friend, Johanna, which is Aramaic for John. Johanna, they started joking. So, we're crossing the bridge now that was built by Sykes-Picot. And they started giving me a hard time about Sykes-Picot. Look, I'm not responsible for Sykes-Picot. That was almost a century ago now, but they were joking. But the memory is very strong there. No, the West, we haven't acquitted ourselves well, let's put it that simply in the Middle East. And the Christians, I think, have felt really let down.
And I guess, because to me, right now we're speaking from a conference about national conservatism, kind of one of the points of which is to lessen, American particularly, but some could say everywhere, like lessen involvement abroad. And so perhaps this is too pointed of a question, so feel free not to answer it. But how do you kind of balance that, like that kind of push that's coming from these kinds of circles to say we should be limiting stuff strictly to kind of our utilitarian interests abroad, but at the same time, the fact that there are people being persecuted abroad, and that your ministry is aimed at helping those people?
Well, I don't think we're talking about military intervention, because some would argue for it, but unfortunately we've seen that hasn't been. We can still be taking care of our own national interests. The perfect example, I always quote them, and they deserve to be quoted because they're doing such a great work, is the great nation of Hungary. Hungary is not sending armies, etc., but Mr. Orban in 2016 met with some of the patriarchs from Iraq and Syria, heard the terrible stories, and this was in August of 2016. By November, I think, he had started a government ministry, the only one in the world, called the State Secretariat for Persecuted Christians. Not the State Secretariat for Diversity or Inclusivity, for persecuted Christians. And they have done magnificent work over these last years, specifically aiding to keep people in their own countries. Building, rebuilding. They haven't been doing the job thing yet, but tremendous work. No other country in the world has done, comparatively, for a small nation, what Hungary has done. So we can do things like that. But in military involvement, we can aid, but also we can deal with trade. That's, I think, a major challenge for Western governments. For example, Nigeria. There's this massive slaughter of Christians. But we have to tell the governments, look, we're not going to trade with you. I know it sounds naive because they're not, governments don't, but we need to put pressure on, okay, you say you're a Christian nation, or you say at least we value human rights, etc. I know it all comes back to China again. Oh, we can't discuss human rights. Trade. No, at some point you have to say, we will not trade unless you start treating your Christian or Uyghurs or whoever it is with respect. So maybe it's naive, but I think it's a possibility, but I don't think it's particularly about military intervention.
And the example of Hungary, it's one that I find interesting for a lot of reasons, but one of which is that in the United States, the idea of having a government bureau specifically for persecuted Christians, even the most conservative politician, probably couldn't get away with it because it would be perceived as a violation of the idea that the government has to sort of be neutral amongst various competing religions. And so I'm wondering what your views are on how to approach these kinds of issues in a nation where that's the case, where we don't have kind of the entrenched hundreds or even thousands of years old religious histories that a lot of places in Europe do.
Yes, it's tricky for the US, but I mean, think in terms of aid, for example, the Hungarian model was very much to not go through these huge world agencies like the UN, and to bypass them and go direct to the churches. And in fact, under the last administration, the Trump administration, US, AID, etc., actually began to work on that model. So there was no government agency called for persecuted Christians, but they realized this is an effective model. We can go directly to the churches, we can help rebuild, etc. So it's possible. The problem is then immediately with the change of administration, all that aid to help persecuted Christians throughout the world has been pretty much stopped, and it's all gone towards the more what we might call woke issues and groups that certainly are not receiving that kind of persecution. So it's possible. You have to be nuanced, you have to be clever, but I think there's a place for European countries, for example, to create a similar agency. I mean, I'm hoping we're not far away from the Italian election. I'm very hopeful, for example, if the right win there, that there's no reason why they couldn't create a similar agency there.
And I want to pivot a little bit to talking more about the West, because Christianity and Christians are not in a perfect position in the West either, much as we might mistakenly think of Christianity as a purely Western religion. And one trend that I've noticed, I mean, actually, the example I'd like to focus on is China, which is not in the West, but I think there are parallels in the way the West has treated this. So China has been, as you are probably aware, rewriting certain passages of the Bible in accordance with their prevailing views about what the attitudes should be towards government. And one particularly horrendous example is they've rewritten John 8 such that when Jesus is called upon to stone a woman, in the Bible, he says, "Let he who has not sinned throw the first stone." In the Chinese translated version, he goes ahead, he not only participates in the stoning, but calls himself a sinner as well, which just renders the entire Bible somewhat nonsensical in a lot of ways. But it's interesting to me because I think it sort of parallels in a more direct and purposeful way the way that much of the West has been kind of treating Christianity for some time now, in which sometimes rather than directly going against it, they or China find it more effective to simply co-opt it or say that it says something that it doesn't. So I guess I'm wondering, and I've sort of I wonder if you comment both on how the West is approaching this and how China is approaching this, but have you encountered this, and how do you think we should be able to respond? Well,
they're similar, but they're different. China is this whole policy of Sinicization. It is. It's a corruption. It's basically like under Nazi Germany, the Reich, it's the state church sanction. That's why the underground church is so important. Why many Catholics are very upset, very unnerved, and angry even about the Vatican-China deal, which has been actually a disaster.
And can you explain for our listeners what happened there?
So the Vatican, there are two. The underground Catholic Church in China has been going since basically the communists took over, and there's what's called the Chinese Patriotic Church, which is a state-sanctioned Catholic Church. And I think it was in 2018 the first deal happened that the Vatican would propose bishops and the Chinese would accept or not. And it was a whole deal to try and, in theory, bring those two churches, the underground and the official church, together. However, it's been seen as a real betrayal. Cardinal Zen, Joseph Zen, the great I think he's 91 now, a cardinal from Hong Kong, has spoken very strongly against this. And the fact is, you don't play cards with someone who's going to cheat.
Right.
And the fact is, it's the old policy, which was called Ostpolitik, from the 50s, late 40s, 50s into the 60s and 70s, which was a Vatican policy that you try and, as it were, make peace with the communists to make sure that the church will survive. Now, when Pope John Paul II, who came out of that experience, became Pope in 78, that stopped. It hadn't worked. It was, the churches were sort of semi-corrupted or weakened. Now this has been revived and it's a disaster. So that policy of creating, it's a Chinese state church, bringing it. It's not Christianity. You can't trust
No, of course.
Yes, in the West, the co-opting is part of the woke ideology. It's part of the. I mean, it might strangely have in the mind of some Christian leaders this idea that, well, we'll be accepted if we sort of go halfway into the ideology of the left, or again, so naive and stupid. That's not the gospel.
Right.
The gospel, we know, was the proclamation, the charisma, and then very scriptural, if it's not accepted, shaking the dust from your feet. We don't say, well, let's keep some of the dust and change. It's a sort of, I call it a reverse evangelization in the West, that the church is being told to change, not the world.
Right.
We're meant to change the world, not have the world change the church. So as I say, they're similar, but also different.
Yeah, it's really interesting and powerful to hear you talk about the experience of John Paul with that, because I didn't know that. Well, I guess maybe I should have guessed, but I was not specifically aware of the fact that kind of attitude, like what's currently being practiced towards China by the church, had been tried before. And in some ways, it makes it frightening that you can't learn from mistakes.
It's a failed policy that one can understand the thought behind it. It was, let's make sure the church survives, so we'll make agreements, but it weakened the church. Poland was different in a way, because Poland was really a very strong Catholic church, but they still had the same thing. They recruited priest informers, and people informed on their priests.
Right.
And John Paul when he came out, he just said, no, this is over. We're not playing this game anymore. And that freed the church. But in many parts of Eastern Europe, still Central and Eastern Europe, the church is only just recovering. It's. I mean, 1989 for some listeners is the same as 1889, but it's not that long ago that people were living under this system, and it's taken a long time for the church to recover.
So I want to ask you also, again, kind of harping on this Western theme and on the idea that you sort of mentioned of the culture broadly kind of transforming the church rather than vice versa. To me, it sort of begs at a question that I've been thinking about for a while about the interests of the church as compared to the interests of the West. Because one of the things that I respect so much about Catholicism is the intensity with which it has preserved Western culture in a way that I will admit that Protestants have certainly not been as committed to. And you can look at instances of, I mean, even something that a very secular person would probably agree with about the way that Catholicism has both preserved and created art is a way that has benefited the West and, in fact, humanity. But it seems to me that there are definitely instances where the interests of the church and the very political interests of the West are not necessarily aligned. And like famous examples being kind of the Middle Ages or the early Renaissance, in which the church was so involved in politics that it kind of delegitimized some of the church's more spiritual messages. But the other example that I often think of is the role that the Episcopal Church has played in America, in which it's sort of at this point, the mask has fallen and it's become clear, in my opinion, I guess I should caveat my opinion having been raised going to Episcopalian church and falling away from it, that in a lot of ways, the Episcopalian church became sort of a club for the upper class and a social grouping, that thrived upon the fact that Christianity was the dominant religion in the region, and most people were expected to be Christian if they were upwardly mobile. And so it's sort of become clear that that was not legitimate as they've fallen away. But I think the fact that the church was so dominant in that way kind of hurt the interests of the church. And I'm sure that you can think of examples within Catholicism as well. I think in a lot of Europe, like genuine Catholicism has really, really suffered in part because the church has been such a dominant kind of cultural force. So I guess it's always kind of a difficult thing for Christians to navigate, the fact that you can be so easily defeated by your own success. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, do you think that the spiritual interests of the church and the political interests of the West are aligned? And how can you build Christian community in such a way that you're not eventually defeated by your success?
Well, I don't think they're aligned in the West now, because most Western governments and states are very secular. So no, they're not. I mean, one goes back to the words of Pope Benedict long time ago. They're quoted often. He was speaking in the 60s, talking about the smaller, purer church that we are. We don't have that power. We don't have that power anywhere in Western Europe, certainly. And maybe that's a good thing. With regard to the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, the point is, of course, the Anglican Church as such, which became the Episcopalian Church in America, was the state church. It is the state church. Yeah. And when the state and the people in the state were in theory Christian, that's fine. But the trouble is, it goes with the zeitgeist. Right. So now you've got all these bizarre things that will happen within the Anglican Church. But no, I think we're very much back to the time of the early days of the church. We are small. Benedict XVI talked about it being a creative minority. But that gets back to what I was saying earlier. We've got to be different, and we are the true counterculture. Now, but you've got to be the counterculture. You can't be half in the culture, and it doesn't mean we have to go off and live in the woods. But we know our history that in ancient Rome, people were converted by seeing, for example, Christians picking up the babies that were abandoned and adopting them and living different lives, being faithful in marriage, having one man, one woman marrying, not three. And so people need to see that in the middle of a city, people are Christian, and they will be. I think it's there's a great quote from Walker Percy, the great American novelist and Catholic. I think he's a convert, I can't remember, but I think once I'll paraphrase him, he said something like, eventually young people are going to get so sick of what they see in the West that they're going to come to the faith. And but we've got to have the faith, or all the attributes you were talking about, art, etc., to attract them. People need to come in, for example, to a church and be enchanted. Part of there's a huge debate in Catholicism at the moment about old liturgy, Latin, etc. And we won't get into that too much, but that need for enchantment, that need to be elevated, lifted up. If the liturgy is sort of kitchen sink, if it's just, you can get it anywhere, churches that look like theatres or churches in the round. No, you want to go in and as it were, almost in integrated breath. And then people have no, and I think many, perhaps slightly less in America, but certainly in many parts of Europe and Britain, England in particular, people of a young age have really no connection whatsoever with even any of the basic doctrines. So they're, in a sense, ripe for conversion, or ripe for the proclamation of the gospel. And that, I think, sometimes, unfortunately, many of the leaders of the church don't realize we're not still in 1950. They think that, the culture's still Christian, churches are open, we're about to have soon a coronation in England, he's the head of the church. Yes, it's all still Christian. No, we're actually underground almost. And that mindset has got to change. That we hear a lot about evangelization, but you've got to evangelize.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm so happy that you've mentioned the example of Rome, because of ancient Rome, in which the early Christians were persecuted. Because to me, that's such an interesting kind of parallel amongst all these different areas in which Christians are being persecuted. And I guess I'm wondering if you can kind of start to tie this all together, because we've talked about, I think the ancient persecuted church in Rome is an interesting sort of third pillar of this, so to speak. But we've talked about Christianity under siege from secularism in the West in like a much more insidious, kind of subtle cultural way, and Christianity under very real, physical, present threat in the East and in the historical homeland of Christianity. What do these two groups have to learn from each other? How do you kind of tie together those seemingly very opposite experiences of Christian persecution?
Well, the key probably is the word martyr.
Yeah.
We know the word martyr means witness. Now, you don't necessarily have to witness to the point of death.
Right.
But we are all called, all of those of us who are called or consider ourselves Christian, are called to witness. So in the West, yes, you're right, the word insidious is very good. I mean, for example, many of the listeners would not know, perhaps there's a case running in Finland at the moment. The former Minister of the Interior, who is a sitting Member of Parliament, Päivi Räisänen, wonderful woman, Lutheran, is being criminally prosecuted for quoting the Bible.
Wow.
On the teaching of marriage between a man and a woman.
Wow.
And many people are saying she's the canary in the coal mine in Europe, to say, well, effectively, it was a long trial, she was actually acquitted, and the Finnish government decided to appeal. So, but if, for example, she is found guilty, basically they're saying the Bible then is now a hate document, hate.
Right.
So, yes, insidious, but the witness of the East, those who've died and are dying for Christ, then gives, we hope, fortitude and strength to the Christians in the West, without being over dramatic. There is persecution. We're not losing our heads, but it's growing, and there we know here in the United States, doctors who are not able to practice,
right.
All kinds of employment issues, suing for people who won't fit in with this. So it's getting the heat's being turned up.
Yeah.
Maybe that's good though, because maybe we've had it too easy for too long. And no one wants it. I mean, wouldn't want an easy life, but the fact is, if you're going to be a real Christian, it was never meant to be.
Right.
The Lord himself said that.
Right.
And in fact, he promised it. He said, if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. I mean, okay, sign me up.
Right. Right.
It's not usually what people think about, oh, that's great, I've become a Christian so I can get persecuted. Maybe we should read between the lines a bit more. So I would say that my personal experience has always been, because the people in the East are just like us. I mean, they're good people, bad people. But it's tremendous strengthening to see people who said, we will not be, when push comes to shove and the real moment comes, we are not going to deny our faith. We would rather leave our towns that we've lived in for generations or even die than deny our faith. And that's going to be the option for us as well.
That is a really powerful statement. I think a great note to end on, Father. I really appreciate you taking the time. You've very unique experiences, so it's really a privilege to be able to hear from you.
Thank you, Annika, for inviting me again.
Thank you so much for listening to our discussion of religious persecution in the Middle East and throughout the world. Wishing a very Merry Christmas to all who celebrate from all of us at the Madison program. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and give us a review. You can also find us on Twitter at Madison Program and Instagram, and find out more about what we do at jmp.princeton.edu. Thank you so much for joining us here on Madison's Notes.